Stories from Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes by Dr. John David Alforts. In the 1990s, I was a teacher with the Department of Defense schools at Bad Kreuznach, Germany. I took my young family to visit many of the sites associated with World War II, the battlefields, the historic monuments, museums, and yes, the concentration camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz. The enormity of what was at stake in World War II was driven home to me. Feeling an enormous sense of gratitude, I began writing to World War II veterans to thank them for the sacrifices they made, and I made a solemn promise to share their stories and to keep them alive if they chose to share them with me. For every letter I wrote, I received far more responses than expected, as the veterans shared my letters with their buddies and even printed them in reunion newsletters. Soon I heard from 140 veterans, 20 of whom received the Medal of Honor. I had far more material than I could ever use in the social studies classes I taught, and I knew this book had to be written. Finally wrote it 30 years later, and today it's published on Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and other fine booksellers. This presentation provides an overview of the book. World War II was a pivotal moment in world history when not only the survival of the United States was at stake, but of democracy throughout the world. World War II veterans will always be known as the greatest generation, for every future generation will be forever in their debt. Their stories must always be told, for as long as they are told, the World War II veterans will be remembered, and we who are left will learn from their incredible courage and sacrifice. These, then, are sacred stories of brave men, of the men you and I owe our lives to, whether we realize it or not. The stillness of dawn was shattered as the Japanese launched a massive attack against the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and with it the fragile peace that the United States had precariously maintained amid gathering war clouds. By the end of the day, 2,638 officers and enlisted men were dead, including 68 civilians. 1,178 more men were wounded, many of them suffering terrible burns. While Pearl Harbor was America's most devastating blow on December 7th, it was by no means the only one. Even as Pearl Harbor was still smoking, Japan launched coordinated attacks on vital U.S. possessions across the Pacific, including Wake Island, the Philippines, Guam, as well as British Malaya and Hong Kong. Shock is hardly the word when Pearl Harbor was bombed and we in the Philippines were tossed into war just as suddenly, Hattie Brantley of Jefferson, Texas recalled. The head nurse quickly reassured her medical team, telling them there wasn't anything to worry about, that they would not be bothered in Luzon by the Japanese. Later that evening, as shots rang out in the jungle, the nurses decided they did indeed have something to worry about. We moved in open buses on the early morning of Christmas Eve to the Bataan Peninsula, and all along the way we had to stop, get out, and lie in ditches because of the bombers, Brantley recalled. When the nurses arrived at the field site, they found that nothing was set up. They went to work creating 17 wards with approximately 35 beds in each. The wounded began arriving, crowding the tiny field hospital number 1 before work was even done setting it up. Brantley found that the easy nights at Fort McKinley were gone for good as the nurses began working from sun to sundown, treating the never-ending flow of casualties. Although there was no shortage of casualties, there was a shortage of supplies. Hattie recalled one badly injured soldier who seemed more concerned about her than he did his own life-threatening injuries. I remember a sweet boy from the Midwest who lost all 4 limbs. I stopped by as often as I could. Once, after a quiet talk, he said, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a situation like this? You shouldn't be undergoing these hardships." Can you imagine? He said that to me. Holed up in the tunnels of Corregidor, the situation became increasingly dire for Brantley and the thousands of others taking refuge there. Brantley recalled the desperate conditions. It was hot and smelly, and we had more than 1,000 patients. With so many people living so close together, nothing was adequate. The food was worse than, well, by this time somebody found a supply of cracked wheat that had been stored in the tunnels in 25-pound bags since 1918. I'm not saying it was edible, but we ate it, and we ate the worm larva that floated to the top of the cereal because it was protein. The people who did not survive would not eat what we had. On May 5th, after an intensive air and artillery bombardment, Japanese soldiers landed on Corregidor and forced the surrender of General Wainwright unconditionally. Brantley would spend the next 32 months as a POW at Santo Tomas internment camp. Gordon E. King of Merrill, Wisconsin, recalled some of the training he received as a paratrooper with the 506th Paratree Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, as downright chilling. How to garrote a sentry with a piano wire. How to break his back with a blow from an entrenching tool. Where to strike so he would die soundlessly. How to use your teeth, your thumbs, your knees on vital spots. To be sure to hold the trench knife close in front of you, thumb up, to cut and slash. How to break his arm and kill him with his own knife. Colonel Sen, commander of the regiment, since his painful birth in the hills of Georgia, reminded us, "Y'all ain't going over there to die for your country. You're going over there to make that other SOB die for his." The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat ever suffered by the United States Navy. Without the benefit of radar or air cover, and without losing a single ship, the Imperial Navy, under Admiral Mikawa's command, destroyed 4 heavy Allied cruisers and killed over 1,000 Allied soldiers, wounding almost as many. William J. Agin of Wrightstown, Wisconsin, a Pearl Harbor survivor, was one of 3 U.S. Navy signalmen temporarily assigned to the Australian cruiser, the HMAS Canberra, to assist in communication between the United States and Australian ships when the invasion of the Solomon Islands occurred on August 7, 1942. After nearly 24 hours at his action station, Agin was sound asleep when the ship's warning whistle blew. Agin was horrified by the carnage he found on the main deck. There was fire all over the place, twisted metal, wreckage, and bodies of men lying all over the deck, some dead, some dying, and some wounded. There was blood and parts of bodies all over. Agin decided the starboard ship of the side of the ship was safer, but found it was no easy task to get there. I crawled through the blood, the parts of the bodies, and the debris of all kinds, just like a rat in a stinking, rotten dump. As I crawled along, I heard this Australian voice say, "Hey, be careful, mate. My guts are lying over there somewhere." As I arrived on the starboard side of the deck, the second salvo came over and fell long about 75 yards off the starboard side. I figured, this is it. The next one is going to get us. The Canberra was listing at about 45 degrees, its propeller completely out of the water. Fires continued to rage below the deck, setting off ammunition, further damaging the ship. The men knew they had to abandon ship. However, the lifeboats had all been destroyed. 2 U.S. destroyers attempted a rescue, but could get no closer than 50 yards to the doomed Canberra. The crew of the Patterson began throwing every line they could towards the desperate survivors aboard the Canberra, who then secured them to whatever they could find. Agin recalled scrambling across the lines to the destroyer's deck. I threw my helmet over to some sailor on the Patterson, and I grabbed the wet, slippery line. I tell you, Tarzan had nothing on me that dark, rainy night as I went hand over hand across. I looked down once, and all I could see was white, churning foam beneath me. It must be remembered that the Patterson had to keep her screws turning to keep the ship alongside us. By the grace of God and the desire to keep from getting my feet wet, I finally sat down on the deck of the USS Patterson. The fighting at Mont Cassino had barely begun when the Allies launched Operation Shingle, landing on Anzio Beach in an attempt to circumvent the Gustav Line. January 22nd to June 5th, 1944, the Germans defended the beachhead with a fearsome 11-inch caliber railway gun known as Anzio Annie, which struck terror on the GIs as it launched 560-pound shells a distance of 40 miles. Anzio Annie and the Luftwaffe's bombardments turned the beachhead into an inferno. Leo Lawrence of Pipersville, Pennsylvania, recalled, "Anzio was my time spent in hell. No one can ever imagine what it was like unless you were there. There are over 10,000 soldiers buried in Anzio because of an area about 10 square miles that the Germans did not want us to have. It's a wonder how the human body can take the constant sounds of artillery, machine guns, bombs, etc., not counting the dead that were all over the ground. We lost 900 men and wounded on the first day of the breakout at Cisterno. History says it was the most casualties of any unit in one day. It was not a nice day for some of your friends." With 156,000 soldiers, 6,939 ships, and 11,590 aircraft, the Allies assembled the greatest invasion force in history for D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Allies needed all the soldiers they could muster. Everyone knew it was going to be bloody. Uncle Sam provided nearly half of the soldiers who landed on D-Day, with the majority of the rest coming from the United Kingdom and Canada. Their target, a 60-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, whose beaches were given 5 nicknames by the Allied command: Omaha, Utah, Sword, Juno, and Gold. John Nedelka of Sequim, Washington, was on Omaha Beach that day. "I will never forget the gunning down of thousands of young men who were from all parts of the USA, my age, who never made it to the top of the cliffs. My guardian angel and God were at my side, to be sure. The young men who hit the beach at Omaha had little chance of survival. The Germans had a good view of the men landing on the beach, firing at everyone who made it off the landing crafts. We were sitting ducks. The beach was covered with dead bodies everywhere. Under those conditions, those that survived the landing made it to the base of the cliffs. We did not know how well the Germans were dug in with pillboxes, trenches, battery guns, and barbed wire." As bad as it was, the carnage at Omaha Beach would have been much worse had it not been for the courageous actions of the 225-member 2nd Ranger Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, who had what General Omar Bradley considered the most dangerous mission of D-Day. The Rangers were charged with landing at Point du Hoc, quickly scrambling up its heavily defended 100-foot cliffs and finding and destroying the enormous 155mm coastal artillery guns the enemy had hidden there, trained on the beaches below. If they survived all that, then the Rangers had to cut off the east-west road between Omaha and Utah beaches, about a mile inland, to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. By the end of their mission on D-Day, the Rangers had suffered 70% casualties. Despite having been the target of Air Force bombing for several weeks, there wasn't a shell crater within 3 miles of the big howitzers. The Air Force had never found them. With a range of 5 miles and plenty of ammunition, the Germans could have used the 5 155mm big guns to murder thousands of Allied soldiers, landing both on Omaha and Utah beaches, as well as hitting those still on the troop convoys at sea. In an August 15, 1993 letter, Lamo recalled how he and Kuhn put the big guns out of commission. "I will never forget the first sight of the 5 big guns at Point du Hoc. I was on a 2-man patrol with my platoon sergeant, Jack Kuhn. It was about 8:15 a.m. D-Day morning. We were nervous as hell. We had infiltrated German lines twice already to get where we were, which was about 200 yards south of the black-topped coastal road opposite from the point. I looked over a high hedgerow, and there were guns in a sort of veil, swale, draw, or whatever you want to call it, in an apple orchard, completely camouflaged with netting and apple trees. A German heavily armed combat patrol had just passed us, not 20 feet away. There were about 40 Germans in the patrol. The big howitzers were like nothing Lommel had ever seen before. They seemed huge to me. High wheels, large, long tube or barrels pointed skyward, too high to reach. They looked like they had been in position for quite a long time. Lommel and Kuhn couldn't believe their good fortune. There wasn't a German in the gun position. Instead, they had assembled in a field about 100 yards away, 75 of them, their backs turned to the howitzers as they listened to their officers. Having seen other Germans in the area, we decided to take advantage of the opportunity as quickly as possible. Jack concealed himself on the top of the high, bushy hedgerow to cover me, while I went in with 2 thermite grenades. The 2 thermite grenades had been given to Lommel and Kuhn specifically for the destruction of the guns. They were a silent but effective weapon. They make no noise or are capable of very intense heat that melts metal such as gears, hinges, moving parts, etc. The 2 men went to work as quickly as they could, using the thermite grenades to complete their crucial mission, as Lommel disabled 2 of the guns and damaged their gun sights with my submachine gun butt. We both ran like scared rabbits as fast as we could behind the high hedgerows on the sunken road about 200 yards. We then gathered up several more thermite grenades. Each man carried one, and we rushed back to the high hedgerow, hiding the guns. We peered over to see if any Germans had returned to the gun position, and finding that they hadn't, Jack Kuhn resumed his guard position, and I re-entered the gun position and finished destroying the remaining 3 guns as I had the first 2. In just 15 to 20 minutes, Lommel and Kuhn had managed to destroy all 5 guns, rendering them inoperable and saving countless lives. Despite receiving both the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star for their bravery, Lommel and Kuhn never considered themselves heroes, just good rangers. We just happened to be at the right place at the right time, Lommel explained. We did what we were trained to do. We were just plain lucky. Living with war. Murray Shapiro recalled the challenges of urinating and defecating while in a foxhole or larger trench. We did not want to foul our own nest, so to speak, but to crawl out of the trench, to exercise either of these bodily functions, was to immediately expose oneself to enemy sniper fire. What we finally ended up doing was urinating into cans or K-ration boxes, and then throwing the waste over the trench top in the direction of the enemy. We simply defecated on the trench floor, then dug up the waste and sufficient dirt underneath, and also tossed the material over the trench in the direction of the enemy. Not meaning to be too gross, but to give an even more realistic picture of the situation, I must add that eliminating natural waste was even more difficult for the many who had GI's diarrhea, and most of us had that most of the time. Sometimes we had no toilet paper, and even when we did, there was no possibility to wash one's hands. As they fought their way through Europe, American GIs found it was sometimes the simple things, like bathing, that they missed the most. Roland Shump got to bathe for the first time in 3 months when his platoon reached a closed swimming pool in Luxembourg, whose showers were open to the GIs. Shump discovered he was infested with lice, along with just about everyone else in the company. We had body lice on us, some about 1/2 inch long. Roll up your shirt or sweater sleeves, and they were covered with lice eggs. We were lucky it was cold, because we would have stunk so bad that we could not have stood ourselves. On November 20th, 1943, the U.S. Marine Corps launched its first amphibious operation in the Central Pacific at the tiny atoll of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. Because the island was so remote, U.S. intelligence was not fully aware of how well the Japanese had fortified the atoll. Tarawa was defended with over 5,000 Imperial Japanese Marines, 400 specialists, an airfield, 37mm to 293mm guns, light tanks, bunkers, and hidden pillboxes. All that on a flat island just 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its broadest point. The battle for Tarawa would cost the Americans dearly. During the 3-day, 76-hour battle, some 6,400 Japanese, Korean, and American lives were lost, nearly 1,000 of which were Marines. The battle was so bloody that it ignited a public outcry back home when enormous losses were reported for such a small, seemingly insignificant island. Dennis H. Olson of Nevada City, California, recalled the horror of Tarawa in a poem. Tarawa Beach at a glance. I was tired and too scared to cry. I was almost certain that I would die. I crouched on the beach and I looked around at bodies in the sea and on the ground. I know some of the faces that I see. Those guys were on the ship with me. There's my buddy, good old Fred, bleeding from a hole in his head. Louie's body is off to my right. He made a bundle in poker last night. I talked to Charlie this morning at chow. His wife will miss him. He's dead now. Dead, dead, dead. All around me they lie. Where's the glory in this way to die? Months of training to get to this spot. Some of them never even fired a shot. I know these guys, but I can't mourn. My mind is filled with too much scorn. Maybe I'll join them in a minute or two, but first I want to kill a few. If I survive this goddamn war, I'll remember friends who died before. Like the Army, the Navy too was segregated during World War II, with African Americans relegated to serving in roles such as a cook or a steward. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt helped to change that when she and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People urged her husband in 1944 to commission the USS Mason, a destroyer, and the USS PC-1264, a submarine chaser, as the only two World War II naval ships with predominantly African American crews. At a time when segregation ruled most of the United States, the USS Mason was fully integrated, with blacks sleeping alongside whites in the bunks and dining together in the mess hall. James W. Graham of Roosevelt, New York, and Lorenzo Dufault of New York, New York, both served on the USS Mason. We had 144 blacks and about 40 whites on board, recalled James W. Graham. This was the first ship in history that had black guys serving as radiomen, quartermasters, and signalmen, recalled Graham, who served as a radioman second class on the USS Mason. In 10 Atlantic crossings between 1944 and 1945, the Mason served with distinction, protecting convoys of ships by dropping depth charges on enemy submarines. The USS Mason's tensest moments were not, however, caused by enemy submarines, but by a fierce hurricane it encountered in the North Atlantic while escorting a convoy of tugboats and barges. Dufault recalled the storm in a 1997 interview in the South Shore Record. The winds were 90 miles an hour, with waves 60 feet high. 1 minute we'd be on top of a wave, then we'd be at the bottom. The storm was so powerful, fear went right out of me. I put my hand in the man's, and I thought, if I survive this, I'll live forever. The tugboats were no match for the hurricane, and 20 of the crew drowned. However, the USS Mason shepherded most of the convoy to safety, then returned in the storm to rescue the shattered ships that remained. The Mason steadfastly protected its convoy, despite a crack that had begun to split its deck. We welded it and we kept moving, Defoe recalled. Afterwards, the officers told the men they would receive a letter of commendation for their valor, but prejudice at the time prevented any such recognition. Lorenzo Dufault served as a signalman on the USS Mason, and he understood that he and his fellow crew members were making history. Our battle was on two fronts at that time, prejudice and the enemy of democracy. We were the first to gain rates other than stewards, mates, and cooks. The black man had been denied the privilege of serving to his full capacity because of prejudice. The purpose of life is to make it better for the next generation. We showed it can be done. Look at the Navy now. I'm 77 years old. I played a role, and I feel good about it. I don't have a lot of money, but I sure have a lot of pride. Alan Onstrom was a tail gunner for the B-17 crew in Northampton, England. My duties as a tail gunner were to protect our B-17 from fighter attack from the rear, Ostrom recalled. Sorry, I had no kills. Ostrom may not have been credited with any kills, but miraculously his crew managed to fly 35 missions without suffering a single loss or injury. This was during a 7-month period when his squadron suffered 85% losses. We were quite fortunate, Ostrom recalled. The 8th Air Force in England had more fatalities in World War II than the entire U.S. Navy. Ostrom remembered that the B-17 crews didn't become very close to the other crews unless they shared the same Nissan hut, knowing the likelihood that they wouldn't be there for very long. However, within their own crew, the airmen shared an incredible bond, as Ostrom described. I cannot help but dwell on the dependency each of us had for one another. With 4,000 pounds of bombs, 2,000 gallons of gasoline, 50-degree temperature, oxygen masks, flak, fighters, 35 other B-17s in our wingtips, these were scary times, and all 10 of us were either teenagers or in our early 20s. Tanks were referred to as steel coffins by many GIs because so many of their crew members were unable to get out when they were hit. Many crew members also lost their lives in beach landings when tanks were released in water that was too deep. Ted Drum was assigned to a tank brigade and achieved sergeant rating, eventually becoming an armored commander. Drum lost his first tank and several crew members during particularly intense fighting in Aston, Holland. We assisted in the destruction of numerous targets, including a building occupied by 50 German soldiers, when our tank was struck 5 times by enemy fire and burst into flames. I crawled over 1,000 yards to join another crew of my battalion. We had a crew of 4. Dale Dykes and myself were the only ones to get out. I was hit with shrapnel, and I got my ears busted. When the tanks were hit and burst into flames, Drum recalled everyone tried to get out the turret. The ones that tried to get out of the bottom didn't make it. Each man in the tank crew had to know how to perform each other's job. If you lost one or more of the crew, you still had to go on, Drum said. Drum made friends quickly. It was a good thing, since his tank crew was constantly changing due to injury or death. As 1944 drew to a close, it seemed that the Allies had the Nazis on the run everywhere. British Field Marshal Montgomery declared confidently on December 15th, "The enemy is at present fighting a defensive campaign on all fronts. His situation is such that he cannot stage any major offensive operations." Montgomery couldn't have been more wrong. Within a day of his remarks, the Germans mounted their largest counteroffensive yet on the Western Front. Amazingly, the Germans assembled 500,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and about 1,500 aircraft. Allied reinforcements were rushed in to defend the Ardennes forest. Even troops back home in the U.S. found they were reassigned. Eventually, the Americans assembled some 600,000 U.S. soldiers to oppose the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. Initially, the German assault pushed the Allies back as far west as 80 miles from their original positions. Hitler's surprise assault cost his army an estimated 120,000 men, with over 12,500 killed and 50,000 captured. The Americans suffered 75,000 casualties, with nearly 8,500 killed and 21,000 reported captured or missing. As a scout, Tom Carr of Merrick, New York, had tried to warn his officers that German soldiers were preparing a sneak attack. For weeks I saw through my scope in the observation post Germans moving supplies in trucks marked with a red cross. When I asked for artillery fire, I was told they couldn't fire on vehicles with a red cross. And then the Germans attacked, killing 1,900 Americans. Carr recalled retreating from St. Vith after a bloody battle on December 21, 1944. St. Vith. I was there until we were driven out in an orderly retreat. We pulled back a long way. For some reason, I don't remember just how long we held on to it. I do remember, though, a great deal of confusion. I believe it was the 10th Division that was on our flank that took the brunt of the attack. They had never been in combat and were sent up to reinforce the line while we, the 2nd Division, attacked those 9 pillboxes. I remember a major from the 106th standing in the street of St. Vith, attempting to stop his men from retreat in a panic. One of the men was running back, and he collapsed in front of me with a bullet hole that was clean through his body. I poured some sulfur, which we all carried, into both sides of his wound. I left him there with a medic, and I rejoined my squad, fighting an orderly retreat. We had absolutely no air support because of an extremely low ceiling, and besides, no one could tell where the front line was and who was where. Ross Rasmussen of Hope Springs, Arkansas, arrived in Le Havre, France, during the second week of December with the 290th Regiment. When the Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th, his regiment was taken by train towards Belgium, arriving in the combat zone on December 20th. After several days of walking, Rasmussen was angered when he came across his first dead American soldier. The Germans had cute psychological tricks, like propping this particular American dead soldier against a fence post with an arm stretched out, holding a canteen cup, appearing to have been asking for water. Rasmussen recalled. His emotions ran the gamut, from first being sad, then angry, and then finally enraged, enough to want to kill any German infantry he saw. Looking back, 50 years later, he is still horrified by what combat did to men such as himself. In the infantry, you get so callous, so disgusted. You lose your decency, your heritage, and you just want to survive, and you get on with the job at hand. The human species can be so vicious, so insane, when involved in close combat situations, and yet there is a softness that survives, and that may be the world's only hope. Years later, Rasmussen seemed appalled by the memory of his own callousness at the Battle of the Bulge, when tired and hungry he sat on top of a dead German soldier and ate his lunch. In the Belgian woods, tired, cold, and time to try and eat, a few of us stopped and took out some K rations. A dead German, stiff from cold and death, had crawled near a large tree to die. I sat down on him, and I ate some cheese and crackers. After finishing, we decided to check out his inside pockets for information. Someone else had already pulled outside pockets inside out. What did we find? A church songbook, and buried within a picture of a woman with 2 small children. I put it back, and I can only hope it was buried with him. I still wonder, where are those kids today? Nicholas Oresko had been shipped to the front with the rest of his platoon in 40x8 boxcars when the Battle of the Bulge began in December 1944. Just before that, my platoon leader, an officer, was sent home on a 90-day rotation. As the platoon sergeant, I became the acting platoon leader of 45 men. All of a sudden, I was in the front leading. It was a real challenge, and I was scared. However, it all worked out. Late in the afternoon of January 23, 1945, Oresko's platoon was ordered to make a third assault on a German position near the Siegfried Line. The first 2 attacks had failed, even with the benefit of artillery cover. For Oresko's assault, there would be no artillery. It had already been spent. When Oresko gave the order to begin the attack, no one in his platoon moved. They still didn't budge when he repeated the order a second time. I said to myself, someone has to go, so I decided to go myself, Oresko later recalled. As he charged up the hill, his men slowly began to follow. The closest was 50 feet behind him, but they were soon cut off from him by German mortar shells. I felt I would die, so I just kept going on by instinct, Oresko explained in a 2000 letter. Oresko reached one of the 2 machine gun emplacements and hurled his handheld grenades into it, destroying the guns. Oresko then shot its gunners before he himself was hit in the hip with bullets from the 2nd machine gun, which was still firing on Oresko's now advancing troops. Presumed dead, Oresko began crawling towards the 2nd machine gun. As he did so, his helmet tripped a booby trap, which exploded over his head. Realizing his remaining grenades had fallen out of his pocket, Oresko crawled back to find them, then retraced his path through the snow. Having found his lost grenades, Oresko once again began crawling towards a second machine gun emplacement. Once there, he threw a single grenade into the machine gun's bunker, waiting for the explosion, and then he jumped in. 6 men had been defending the machine gun. 3 were killed by the blast of the grenade. Oresko finished the others with his rifle before he himself, badly wounded, finally collapsed. Because of Oresko's one-man assault, the Americans took sole possession of the hill that had twice defied them. In doing so, Oresko had eliminated 2 machine gun emplacements and killed 12 enemy soldiers. He was also gravely injured. The wounds were serious to my right hip, Oresko recalled in a 2000 letter. I happened to turn, and the burst caught me across the hip rather than the stomach. I was lucky. Despite receiving the Medal of Honor and having been grateful that his successful assault allowed the hill to be taken with minimum American casualties, Oresko was always haunted by his actions that day. He later said, "I think about that incident every day. It never leaves you. When you kill somebody, even though it's combat, you remember it, or it remembers you." Edgar Culo of Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, was a prisoner of war in German camps. He remembered the conditions as being deplorable. "We did not have much of anything. Little heat, water, soap, and especially food. I'm only a little guy. I weigh 140 pounds, which is what I weighed when I was captured. By the time I was liberated, I was down to about 90 pounds. One thing we had, though, was plenty of lice and fleas. The bunks were full of them." Culo didn't mind the lice as much as the fleas. Every so often, the Germans deloused the POWs. However, Culo felt he could never get rid of the fleas. The minute you laid down, you could feel the fleas crawl up your legs, and then all over they went. You just couldn't stop them all. The POWs never had enough food. 2 men were given 1 Red Cross parcel every week. The parcels contained coffee, jam, margarine, peanut butter, powdered milk, chocolate, cigarettes, biscuits, Spam, and several other items. Since Culo didn't smoke, he would trade his cigarettes for more food whenever possible. There were some French POWs who worked at a bakery near the Hammerstein Stalag. They sometimes brought bread in to trade. Culo recalled one POW trading a $50 watch for a loaf of bread. The meals got even worse as the wars progressed, but Culo did not necessarily blame the Germans. The German civilians were hurting almost as bad as we were. There was so little food, Culo said in an interview. As a result of their near constant hunger, the GIs spent most of their time talking about food and what they would eat if they returned to the States. "You would think our topics would have been girls or cars or sports, but instead it was food," Culo remembered. Escape was almost out of the question. After a while, the GIs were so weak from malnourishment that they lacked the energy to make an attempt. The POWs also knew that for every 2 guys who escaped, 10 prisoners who stayed behind would be shot. "That was a powerful deterrent," Culo replied. Dysentery was a constant problem for the POWs. In their weakened states, dysentery could be the death sentence for any POW unlucky enough to come down with it. One day you would see them, skin and bones, sitting on a can most of the day. Then the next day you wouldn't see them anymore, Culo recalled. Robert Bowen was a staff sergeant in the 401st Glider Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division. Bowen was already a veteran soldier, a survivor of D-Day, Operation Marketplace, when he was wounded and taken prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge. He was stashed in the basement of a house, which served as a makeshift aid station. The position was declared hopeless, and the company withdrawn at nightfall. Unfortunately, the house had been cut off. All wounded, some members of the tank and tank destroyer crews, and a few men from the company were captured. The next day, Bowen was operated on in a German aid station, where shrapnel was removed from his abdomen and right wrist. His wounds necessitated several subsequent surgeries. During one of Bowen's surgeries at a clearing hospital in Eichkirchen, Germany, just west of Bonn, an Allied air raid dropped a bomb alongside the hospital. The explosion infuriated the German doctor, who began strangling Bowen even as he lay on the operating table. Bowen was only spared when an American who was also badly wounded in the leg pulled the doctor off of him. After the raid, the doctor apologized. As a wounded POW, Bowen was moved around a lot. He endured a 7-day train ride in a boxcar packed with 70 men to Bremerhaven. There were no toilet facilities except for a small can, and food was limited to a Red Cross parcel split between 2 men with a can of water. Men died. Others went insane in the car after it was strafed by our planes. During the ride, when there wasn't enough room to lie down, half the men stood for 2 hours while the other half sat. I developed phlebitis in my right leg. It turned into thrombophlebitis, and that into a pulmonary infection. Bowen found the conditions as a POW deplorable. Personal hygiene was impossible to keep up with: soap, towels, shaving equipment, and hot water. The POWs did not even have toilet paper. They were given one blanket and lice-filled straw to sleep on. As a result, all of the POWs were covered with body lice. Food was scarce. Breakfast consisted of a cup of coffee and 2 slices of black bread. Dinner was generally a cup of soup. During the last 2 months of the war, when Bowen was in a Stalag hospital, Red Cross parcels began arriving, and the POWs began to eat a little better. But it wasn't enough for Bowen, who lost 50 pounds as a POW. Bowen wrote, "The deplorable living conditions turned minor injuries into those that became life-threatening." His spirits undoubtedly would have improved had he received an occasional letter from home. But his wife had received a letter telling her that her husband had been killed in combat. As a POW, I was unable to contact my wife, telling her I was safe. While she still held out hope, Christine Bowen thought for months that her husband was dead. One night, at the beginning of May 1945, just 3 nights before the British Guards Division would arrive to liberate the camp, less than a week before the unconditional surrender of all German forces, Bowen heard German machine guns firing all through the night. The machine gun fire was coming from the end of the compound where the POWs were imprisoned. Bowen knew what the gunfire signaled. They were executing these prisoners. My God, the war was ending. It was only a week afterward the Russians took Berlin. How hideous. British forces fought to liberate the POW hospital at Bremerhaven, where Bowen was a prisoner. Despite the fact that the Stalag had no legitimate military value, the Germans moved a tank battalion in and around the hospital. For 2 days the British shelled the hospital before they attacked. Once the British captured the Stalag, the Germans retaliated by shelling the place. The shelling from both sides killed approximately 25 to 30 POWs. While the Germans were still shelling the camp, Bowen was led out past the bodies of the POWs he had heard shot a few nights before. 50 years later, he was still horrified by the senseless execution that occurred. I saw 100 or more naked bodies stacked beside some of the buildings at one end of the camp. Did this have any bearing on the fight for the stockade? I don't know. The war was less than a week before its end. Were the Germans driven by their obedience to orders, or were they so craven as to do what they could to strike back at people who they thought were inferior to them and were about to win? I don't know that either. Okinawa was a costliest battle in the Pacific Theater. During the 83-day battle, 110,000 Japanese were killed and another 10,755 taken prisoner. Over 900 kamikaze planes were sacrificed, and they sank 36 U.S. Navy ships and damaged another 365. The battle cost the U.S. Army and Marines 7,613 killed and the Navy nearly 5,000 dead. The U.S. invasion suffered over 58,000 casualties. Clarence Craft of Fayetteville, Arkansas, led an attack on May 31, 1945, on Hen Hill in Okinawa, which served as the strategic center of the Japanese line of defense. For 12 days, American GIs had been pinned down, suffering heavy casualties as they had tried to take the hill. Kraft was angry that so many of his buddies were being shot down as they tried in vain to penetrate the Japanese defenses. In a 1919 letter, Kraft described his thinking. I was mad at the Japanese, and we had been pinned down too long. The United States Army trains men to handle themselves in such matters. Without the good training, I would not have survived. Kraft was sent as a forward scout and frontline rifleman in advance of his company to test the enemy resistance. Moving out in a diamond formation, the group immediately drew fire from the Japanese machine guns and grenades. 3 of the 5 men were injured. Driven by his anger and his fright, Kraft wrote, "Anybody that isn't frightened in a situation like that is nuts." He went on a one-man attack. According to his Congressional Medal of Honor citation, he stood up in full view of the enemy and began shooting with deadly marksmanship wherever he saw a hostile movement. He steadily advanced up the hill, killing Japanese soldiers with rapid fire, driving others to cover in their strongly disposed trenches, unhesitatingly facing alone the strength that had previously beaten back attacks in battalion strength. Standing atop Hen Hill, Kraft was running out of everything. The other men that was left in my squad helped me by passing me grenades and satchel charges up from the base of the cliff, Kraft wrote in a 1999 letter. He also directed his comrades on where to throw their grenades. Adrenaline pumping, Kraft fought on, charging up to the main enemy trench. His citation described what happened next. Straddling the excavation, he pumped rapid fire into the Japanese at point-blank range, killing many and causing the others to flee down the trench. Pursuing them, he came upon a heavy machine gun, which was still creating havoc in the American ranks. With rifle fire and a grenade, he wiped out this position. By the time the Japanese were in complete rout and the American forces were swarming over the hill, Kraft followed the retreating enemy to the mouth of the cave. There he tossed a satchel charge into the cave, sealing the enemy in what became their tomb. Kraft's attack had a far-reaching consequence, for Hen Hill was the key to the entire defense line, which rapidly crumbled after his utterly fearless and heroic attack. In all, he killed an estimated 25 enemy soldiers. Later, Kraft would also fight in the Korean War, before he became a 100% disabled veteran. He spent his last years volunteering at the VA hospital, where he himself went for psychiatric treatment as he suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Although he received lots of recognition for his heroism in the war, having both a park in his hometown and part of the VA hospital in Fayetteville named in his honor, Kraft admitted, "I would really like to forget it. I just had a job to do. I was in the right place at the right time. I just lucked out." Nearly 12 million people are estimated to have been killed in the Holocaust, in the Nazi Holocaust. When the American GIs began to liberate the camps, they weren't prepared for what they saw. Barney Zilka of Duluth, Minnesota, liberated Dachau camp, and he remembered, "We had a tank knock down the iron fence at Dachau, and we went in with rifles ready because there were Krauts dressed like prisoners and taking shots at us. I never saw any snipers, but as I was looking at the thousands of 60-pound skeletons lying on their bunks, piled over each other 6 or 7 layers high, I was wishing and crying at the same time that I would see a Kraut and empty my rifle into his belly." When me and a sergeant broke into Dachau, the ovens were still burning, and heads and feet were sticking out of them. I cried like a little kid, and I threw up. Even dead soldiers didn't bother me, but those concentration camps, I'll never forget. David Saltman of Wantagh, New York, was a liaison officer and the unit historian for the 638th Tank Destroyer Battalion. He recognized that war might seem glorious to the folks at home, but to the boys fighting and doing the dying, it was anything but. To the man who has to take it on the chin all the time, it's better to be wounded and to get out of it alive, because you never know when your number is going to be up. The soldier doesn't fight for glory or romance or anything of the kind. He fights because he knows he has to, and constantly his feeling is that the quicker he finishes with the war, the quicker he gets home. War is not glorious to the man up front. It's just plain hell. When I was writing The Veterans of World War II during the 1990s, the 50th anniversary celebration of the end of the war was well underway. Many of the veterans found that the renewed attention to World War II caused them to begin having post-traumatic stress once again, and their nightmares returned. Donald Chase dealt with such things through writing poetry. His poem Dreams. Life is pleasant and sunshine's bright light, but apprehension begins with the coming of the night. You fall asleep, but dreams fill your mind of days of terror once thought left behind, of days on an outpost in no man's land, seeing the pieces of what once was a man. Who he was, no one will know. Only part of his head and one hand show. The unseen mortar coughs up its shell, followed by a blast that casts its spell. There is nowhere to go, no place to hide, as the screaming shrapnel spreads ever so wide. At last it's quiet, but you still hug the ground, shocked at first by the absence of sound. The heartbeat slows, and you wake to find it's just another dream playing tricks with your mind. These scenes of battles from days long ago are kept buried inside so no one knows, and although you try with all your might, you can't stop the dreams that come with the night. As the voices of World War II veterans fall silent, it is left for those of us who follow in their footsteps to tell their stories and to speak their names, so that all that they endured for you, for me, for future generations will forever be remembered. As long as their stories are told, the veterans of World War II will live on. Their stories are told in my book, Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Smashwords, and other fine booksellers. You can scroll back to the beginning slide in this presentation to see the websites where you can purchase this book. Thank you again for listening, and if you would like to contact me, you can do so at patriots37@protonmail.com. Again, patriots37@protonmail.com. Thank you for helping me remember these veterans, honor their memories, and tell their stories. Goodbye.